A lot of Christian nationalists think they can conquer the country, but won't even try to conquer their grandma's old Methodist church. Hey guys, welcome back to KingdomCraft, where we build churches in Minecraft while talking about Christianity. My church is over there, so I'm working on my seminary today, but I'm building the chapel in my seminary, so I'm kind of building a church within a seminary within a church. So I believe in not wasting your guys' time, so if you just want my quick opinion on Christian nationalism, this movement that's really controversial these days, it's that I sympathize with it, but I think there's a lot of problems with it, so I think there's a much better alternative. So what is Christian nationalism? I think it gets defined wrongly in today's conversations because it doesn't mean what it used to mean. It used to mean a conflation of faith and politics. It used to mean churches that would sing patriotic hymns or fly American flags absolutely everywhere or have, Donald Trump signing their Bibles. That's what Christian nationalism used to refer to. But ever since 2020, the mainstream media, used the term Christian nationalist to refer to basically any conservative Christian who cared about making the culture more conservative. So basically any Christian who was involved in the culture war from any sort of right-wing perspective at all got branded by the media as a Christian nationalist, even though that's not what Christian nationalist used to mean. And then what happened is some conservative Christian groups like, Doug Wilson's post-millennial crowd, they ended up sort of reclaiming the term Christian nationalist, even though it was originally used as an insult. They were like, heck yeah, we're Christian nationalists. And their definition was a lot different than the original one. Their definition was, we're Christian nationalists because we want to make the nation more Christian. And making the nation more Christian for them didn't just mean converting individual people in the nation to Christianity. It meant transforming the nation, transforming all of its institutions to glorify God, to glorify Christ, to Christianize the entire culture, not just Christianize individuals within the culture. And in that sense, I agree that that's the right thing to do. I think the church should be doing that. So if that's all Christian nationalism is, I think the name denotes a lot more than that. It denotes a specific movement, but that general principle, I fully agree with. I think they have the correct model of how Christ relates to culture. This 20th century theologian, who I'm going to be talking about in the next episode, Reynold Niebuhr, had this thing where there's like 5 models of Christ and culture, and the last one, the 5th one that he talked about that he agrees with, that I agree with, is called Christ the Redeemer of culture, where you think Christianity is supposed to transform culture, not separate itself from it. And I fundamentally agree with that. I talk all the time about how Christians are to be salt and light in the world. Jesus said, "You are the salt of the world." What does salt do? It preserves what is good. Christians are supposed to make the culture better. And yes, that means getting involved in the power structures of the culture, maybe even the government. That's what Christians did in the Roman Empire. Christians made the Roman Empire a better place in many ways. Christians said it was illegal to be a pedophile in the Roman Empire, which was very common before Christianity showed up. Christians said, no, if you have a baby and the baby turns out to be a girl, you can't throw that baby to the lions just because you want a baby boy. Christianity, and I guess you could say Christian nationalism in some sense, made the Roman Empire a much better place, a much more humane place, a much less barbaric place to live. Christianity drastically transformed Rome, and Christianity, I believe, turned America into one of the most successful societies in the world. Now, of course, the Founding Fathers, a lot of them were not, theologically orthodox Christians. For example, Thomas Jefferson was a deist, and a lot of them were Christians, but maybe not that involved in their faith. But all the Founding Fathers still saw America's culture as a Christian culture, and they could not conceive of an America that was not Christian. They believed Christianity was useful for society. And before the Founding Fathers, the first settlers in America, like the Puritans, they were extremely religious Calvinists. So you could argue that America is not only a Christian nation in its origins and its roots, but specifically a Calvinist nation. And I did make that argument in a paper that I wrote, the last ever essay that I wrote in school ever. I made that specific argument, that America is specifically a Calvinist nation, and the Calvinism of America's founders can be credited for why America has been the most successful nation in human history. So yeah, America made Rome great. Not America. Christianity. Christianity made Rome great. Christianity made America great. And I think Christianity is necessary for America to survive as a nation. So everything I've said makes me sound a lot like those Christian nationalist guys, but I think there's a big problem with their movement. The problem with their movement, though, is not really a theological one, it's a strategic one. There are three big flaws in the strategy of the Christian nationalist movement that I see articulated by like Doug Wilson or Joel Webbin, and I have plans to talk to both of those guys, by the way. I hope to raise these concerns, so I hope to give them some constructive criticism. But there's three big flaws in their strategy. Number one, it's too retreatist. Number two, it's not elitist enough. And number three, I think it needs to focus on recovering old institutions rather than just trying to start new ones. Okay, so one at a time. First of all, yes, it is too retreatist. A lot of these Christian nationalists promote a retreat from the mainstream cities and universities. They promote this kind of, moving off to the rural areas, just starting a big family, and maybe your grandkids can conquer the country. Because, I don't blame them, because the cities and the mainstream universities, all the organs of mainstream culture these days, are deeply hijacked by all sorts of evil. So yeah, I do not blame them for thinking this way, but it's still not necessarily a good mindset. There's never really been a time in history where the people who retreat from the battlefield end up winning the war. There might be some temporary retreats that are useful, but they don't seem to have a long-term strategy, a specific long-term strategy for how they are going to take over the current cultural centers of influence. Generally, the rhetoric is, if the cities are, corrupt and liberal, you have to flee the cities, move to a farm in the middle of nowhere. If the universities are corrupt, you have to not send your kids to college. If the public schools are corrupt, you have to not send your kids to school. And again, not everything they're saying is bad, and a lot of what they're saying is justified, but it's just a broad general mindset of retreating. And I think that is a losing mindset. That kind of is the mindset that Christians have employed for the past 100 years due to fundamentalism. The fundamentalist movement had a huge impact on American Christianity as a whole. And the zeitgeist of the fundamentalist movement was, you have to retreat from everything that is mainstream, because everything is stained by sin, you have to retreat. Now, unlike the fundamentalists, these people are post-millennial rather than premillennial in their eschatology. The fundamentalists were premillennial. They thought Jesus was coming back any second, the world was about to get destroyed, so you just have to get off this sinking ship of a world as soon as you possibly can before the apocalypse, basically. And to their credit, the Christian nationalist crowd is generally post-millennial, meaning they believe in the eventual victory of Christianity, of Christendom, over the pagan nations. Yeah, and that's to their credit. So they are not the same as the fundamentalists. However, they still adopt from the fundamentalists, I think they just inherited it from it because it's deeply rooted in American conservatism, a mindset of retreat, that if something is corrupt, if a church or a school or a city is corrupt and liberal, the answer is to run from it, to retreat. And that's something that I think needs to change if they are actually going to accomplish what they want to accomplish. Like, Doug Wilson, he has done a pretty decent job, a very decent job, I would say, at, transforming Moscow, Idaho, which is a town in the middle of nowhere that nobody has ever heard about except people in his inner circle. However, I'm someone who was born and raised in the New York City area. I think if Christians are really to have an impact on the culture, we can't move to the middle of Idaho and try to transform tiny towns there. We have to move to the big cities. Cities are where culture happens. This is something Tim Keller was fundamentally right about. Even though Tim Keller wasn't much of a cultural transformationalist himself, he was right that the way the early church took over the Roman Empire was not by moving to farms in the middle of nowhere. It was by going to the big cities. From the very beginning, where did the apostles first go? They didn't go to farms in the middle of nowhere. It's not like the apostles all just moved to the countryside and started big families, had a million billion kids. then their great-grandkids conquered the Roman Empire. No, they went outside their comfort zone. They went to the big cities, even though those big cities were, bastions of paganism. That didn't stop them. They were unafraid. They were just like, yeah, even though we'll probably die for our faith here, it's still worth it. That's not the rhetoric I see from these Christian nationalists, though. The rhetoric I see from the Christian nationalists is, yeah, these cities and stuff, they're all dirty, they're all stained by sin, so you just have to retreat. And I'm not saying that they don't care about redeeming those cities, they just see that as much more of a long-term goal than I do. I think if Christians are to be culturally relevant, to have a good impact on culture for the kingdom of God, we need to be involved in the mainstream cities, the mainstream universities, all that right now. That's why I encourage Christians to, if they're from a major city, to stay there, even if the city is liberal. It's like the apostles went to cities that were pagan as well. And that's how the apostles took over the Roman Empire. It used to be in the Roman Empire that the cities were Christian and the countryside was pagan. Cities always have more of an influence over the countryside than the countryside has over the cities. That's why Christianity conquered the Roman Empire. However, it's the opposite paradigm in today's world. In today's world, the cities are a lot less Christian than the countryside, and that's one of the reasons Christianity keeps losing the culture war, because they've lost all the centers of power, one of which is the cities. The word pagan used to refer to like a rural person, a person from the countryside, because it used to be that the countryside was pagan and the cities, the urban centers, were Christian. Christianity conquered the cities first and then expanded to the countryside. But the strategy of these Christian nationalists seems to be to start from, red state areas and then move into the blue state areas. The problem is the red state areas are largely less developed, less educated, rural places. I'm not saying they're bad, I'm just saying those are not the most powerful places from which to take over the rest of culture. And yes, I am very much a New York elitist. Some people think that's a problem I have. I don't think it's a problem, because I think elitist is not a bad word. And that brings me to my next point of where I think they have the wrong strategy. They're not elitist enough. Elitist is not a bad word. I gladly label myself a coastal elite. I am from New York, and, I've a very, white-collar family background. And I believe that Christians should become elites, because elites are the ones who make cultural change. Jordan Cooper has a lot of really good stuff about this. Jordan Cooper is also from the Northeast like I am, so that means he sympathizes a lot with my elitist tendencies. Jordan Cooper has a lot of videos about how change doesn't come from, working class hillbillies. Change is always from disaffected elites. So the elites that are happy with the way things are, they're not going to make change because, why would they? They're happy. And, working class people, cultural change doesn't generally come from them. They can help elites make cultural change, but it doesn't originate with them because they just don't have the cultural power to do so. They might have the numbers, but numbers aren't everything, because the elites, they have a lot more power to change culture per person than, working class people do. So I'm not anti-working class or anything, and the working class these days is generally more Christian. But if we want to change the culture, we need a lot more elites who are Christians. We need a lot more Christian elites. We need to Christianize the elite institutions like the mainstream universities and all that stuff. So because of that, I don't like how the Christian nationalist movements tend to be very anti-elitist. They tend to be very populist. And while that can inspire a lot of people, while that can inspire big numbers of people, those movements tend to not make very much cultural change. So that's why, if Christian nationalism is actually going to achieve the goals that it wants to achieve, it needs to be more elitist. Elitist is not a bad word. So, that leads me to my third point. So they say, we are going to abandon the elite institutions because they're just way too corrupted, we're just going to start our own. So that's why, Doug Wilson, for example, he does care about institutions, and I applaud him for that, but he seems more focused on rebuilding than retaking. Rebuilding is one of the alternatives to Reconquista that people promote. So Reconquista means retaking the mainline Protestant churches, the ones that have been hijacked by liberals, rather than splitting off and forming new denominations. Like Doug Wilson, as well as most of these Christian nationalists, he's part of the CREC, which is a brand new denomination, very conservative denomination, and it's dedicated to, making the culture more Christian. That's what a lot of the CREC people are invested in. And again, that's a good thing to be invested in. But the CREC is by no means a mainline or mainstream denomination at all. It does not have a lot of the resources that the mainline denominations have. So a lot of people ask me, if there are more conservative reformed denominations, why do I stay in the liberal PCUSA? One of the answers I always give is because the PCUSA is the mainstream elite establishment denomination, and the other denominations like the PCA, the OPC, especially the CREC, they are not establishment at all. The reason this matters is because elite institutions are necessary for making cultural change, and the PCUSA, even though it's been hijacked by liberals, it is the more elite of the institutions, and that's why it was hijacked in the first place. The leftists understand things that a lot of conservative Christians don't. The leftists understand that to make cultural change, you need to hijack elite institutions. The reason they targeted mainline Christian denominations like the PCUSA and the United Methodist Church and the Episcopal Church is because they knew how vital strong Christian institutions were for the survival of a Christian nation, and that's why they were so successful after they hijacked these mainline denominations. So any revival of Christianity in America must come from the mainline Protestant churches, the elite churches, the established churches. We shouldn't just give up and try to start new ones, because you cannot simply build a brand new elite institution from scratch. I guess if you start something brand new now, then maybe in 400 years it could evolve into something that's elite. It probably will if you give it enough time and you keep investing in it generation after generation after generation. But we don't have that kind of time. Every single year, the culture drifts further and further from God. So if we're going to make any substantial cultural change in our lifetime, we need to retake existing elite cultural institutions. Now, I'm not opposed to building new institutions. I'm not opposed to what Doug Wilson is doing, trying to start, new universities. I think he has a new university, like New St. Andrews College or whatever. It's like, I've not gone there. I don't personally know many people who have gone there, but it is not a highly rated university by any means, and, why should it be? It just started. So, yes, it's good to create new things. There's nothing wrong with creating new things, but I think it is wrong to see those new things as a substitute to retaking old things. So if we're going to start these new churches, if we're going to start these new universities, it must be in conjunction with retaking old things rather than an alternative to retaking old things. That's why I'm generally against the church planting movement in America. Of course, in, unchurched countries, unchurched lands, of course you need to plant new churches. But generally, church planting in America weakens established churches that have more cultural rootedness and resources because there's something attractive about the freshness of a brand new community. But church plants don't last. Church plants don't have much of an influence on culture. Church plants are not elite institutions. So that's why in America, I think rather than planting new churches, we need to focus on reviving old church communities. So if a church is going to send people into a new church plant, rather than doing that, they should probably send people to revive an old, dying mainline church. That's what they should do. So yeah, to recap, the three main issues with the Christian nationalist movement is, one, it's too retreatist. It needs to focus on going back to the centers of power. It needs to encourage people to leave their comfort zones. Two, it needs to be more elitist. Yes, it's good that it's appealing to working class men, but it needs to appeal to more than just the working class. It needs to get some elites on board. And three, it needs to focus on recovering old universities and churches rather than simply and exclusively creating new ones. So I'm going to speed this up while I work on the outside of the chapel.